Olá, como vai? Tudo bem? É um prazer recebê-las virtualmente na Universidade de Brasília. Nós estamos agora iniciando o nosso 36º Colóquio de Educação Crítica para o Sul Global. Considere a Universidade de Brasília como extensão da sua própria casa acadêmica. Nessa oportunidade singular, nós seremos hoje de receber um intelectual negro muito conhecido tanto no contexto africano quanto no contexto internacional, para discutir um pouquinho sobre línguas e sobre a cultura africana. E para que a gente possa iniciar justamente esse colóquio, eu gostaria de convidar a professora Camila. Por gentileza, Camila, seja muito bem-vinda. É um prazer e uma honra recebê-la também virtualmente na Universidade de Brasília. Eu tenho certeza, Camila, que a sua mediação e o seu diálogo com o professor Quentin Williams irá contribuir muito para o nosso crescimento acadêmico profissional e também com as colaborações que nós temos e mantemos com a África e com a África do Sul. Eu queria só começar, Camila, esse colóquio com o seguinte tom. Eu queria, em público, externar minha gratidão pela sua existência, Camila, e pela sua resistência, e também agradecer a Camila, que gentilmente investiu grande parte da sua energia e do seu tempo para a materialização de uma iniciativa acadêmica entre a Universidade de Brasília, a USP e a Capital University com o professor Quentin Williams. E para nossa alegria, né, Camila, nós tivemos aprovação do nosso projeto na Fundação de Amparo à Pesquisa do Estado de São Paulo, em que nós vamos fazer um projeto de mobilidade internacional, USP, UNB e Capital, e pensar iniciativas e colaborações. E eu acho que para a gente celebrar essa conquista coletiva, esse aquilombamento coletivo, a gente vai ter hoje, né, Camila, a oportunidade de ter a sua mediação com o professor Quentin Williams. Então, mais uma vez, em nome do nosso grupo de pesquisa, o grupo de estudos críticos e avançados em linguagem, eu queria saudar a Camila, saudar o nosso ilustre convidado, o professor Quentin Williams. E agora, Camila, o palco é todo seu. The floor is yours.
Boa tarde, professor Kleber. Boa tarde a todos. Né? Que prazer estar aqui nesse aquilombamento sempre promovido pelo professor Kleber, né? Que sempre consegue. Eu falo que ele é um catalisador de pessoas sensacionais, né? De potências. Então, sempre quando a gente se reúne, sempre tem pessoas muito especiais envolvidas ao redor do professor Kleber. E é um prazer estar aqui, né? Eu sou professora doutora em Linguística também, aí parceira do professor Kleber no GECAL, parceira também, pesquisadora na USP, fiz o meu doutorado na Unesp, e nos últimos anos tenho estado muito lá na University of Western Cape, que é do lugar de onde fala o professor Williams, e foi lá que eu tive o prazer de conhecer ele nessas idas e vindas de Brasil, entre Brasil e África do Sul, e ter esse prazer de estabelecer essas conexões tão poderosas, né, professor Kleber? Então, é um prazer, eu desejo que todos sejam muito bem-vindos, que a gente possa ter uma discussão muito interessante desses assuntos aí todos que o professor Williams, ele traz também, uma pessoa muito engajada socialmente, dentro e fora, né, da academia aí, que está presente também na construção de políticas linguísticas na África do Sul. Ele vai explicar um pouquinho para vocês do que é o Afrikaaps, ou o Kaaps, né, lá na sociedade sul-africana, especificamente ali em Cape Town, na cidade do Cabo, e a gente espero que esse diálogo seja muito proveitoso para todos os lados, né, para a gente aprender muito aí com o professor Williams, e para ele também dialogar bastante com a gente produtivamente aqui. Eu queria apresentar, então, eu vou colocar uns slides na tela para mostrar para vocês que poderoso, né? Que poderosa que é essa biografia desse professor que vai estar aqui dialogando com a gente hoje. Então, mais uma vez, todos bem-vindos, né? Nesse 36º já, né, professor Kleber, Colóquio de Educação Linguística, que é do GECAL, que eu sempre fui espectadora e hoje eu estou aqui na mediação. Que honra, né? Estar aqui, ainda mais com vocês. E hoje, a palestra de hoje, né, que vai ser do nosso convidado, o professor Dr. Quentin Williams, da University of the Western Cape. O nome da palestra é The Miseducation of Kaaps, ou Afrikaaps Learners, Decolonial Challenges and Opportunities. A gente vai entender um pouquinho mais ao longo da fala do professor o que seria o Kaaps e o Afrikaaps. Acho que vocês vão achar bem interessante. e, mais uma vez, né, a organização do Grupo de Estudos Críticos e Avançados em Linguagem da UNB, do qual eu tenho o prazer agora de fazer parte. Então, tem as informações aí, sigam a nossa página, sigam aí no YouTube para ficar por dentro das palestras, e aqui ficam gravadas também várias palestras anteriores, né? Então, é muito interessante sempre estar seguindo as páginas, as redes sociais aí do GECAL para ficar por dentro de tudo. E o nosso convidado, né? O nosso convidado ilustríssimo, professor Quentin Williams. Então, o professor Quentin Williams, ele é da University of the Western Cape, que seria a Universidade do Cabo Ocidental, na África do Sul, na cidade do Cabo. E o professor, ele é diretor do Center for Multilingualism and Diversities Research, um centro de multilinguismo e diversidades muito interessante lá na África do Sul. Quem tiver o prazer de estar lá para dialogar com os pesquisadores de lá, é um lugar muito, muito produtivo em termos de estudos de multilinguismo e políticas linguísticas, tem a sua importância ali dentro da África do Sul. Ele é professor titular de Linguística, né, no Departamento de Linguística também da Universidade do Cabo Ocidental. Ele já foi Gent Chair Professor na Universidade da Bélgica, né, e no Center for Afrikaaps, Afrikaans and the Study of South Africa da Ghent University, na Bélgica, em 2022. Ele também é coeditor do periódico Multilingual Margins, que é também esse periódico do Centro de Multilinguismo e Diversidades. Ele também é fundador e presidente da Society Vaire Advancement van Kaaps. Será que eu falei certo? Do you think I'm pronounced correctly, Professor Williams? You let me know later, because I don't speak Kaaps, but I'm trying. E ele também é cofundador da Heal the Hoods Hip Hop Lecture Series, que além de todo esse combo maravilhoso, né? O professor ele é dos estudos de hip hop, então ele já foi pesquisador aí, é pesquisador de hip hop no contexto sul-africano, e foi o que interligou a gente da primeira vez, porque eu também estudei estéticas periféricas e hip hop no contexto brasileiro. Então foi o que nos aproximou aí nos estudos de linguística, multilinguismo e hip hop, dessas estéticas. E ele tem esse fórum da African Hip Hop Indaba. Então, os interesses aí de pesquisa do professor Williams incluem e não se limitam a multilinguismo, cidadania linguística, que é um conceito muito interessante, desenvolvido lá na África do Sul e entre pesquisadores do Sul Global, que ele talvez vá tocar no assunto também. Já esteve aqui no Brasil falando também sobre esse conceito de cidadania linguística. Cultura popular, como a gente já disse especificamente aí, sobre a linguagem, a cultura hip-hop, práticas marginalizadas de multilinguismo, intelectualização da língua Kaaps, né, que ele vai falar, também conhecido como Afrikaaps, ativismo linguístico e sociolinguística pública. E aí, entre as publicações principais do professor, né, que são muitas, e a gente elencou aqui algumas das diversas, né, que tem publicações de destaque, mas ele publicou já na Applied Linguistics, Applied Linguistics Review e Social Linguistic Studies. Os livros deles mais recentes são o Global Hip Hopography, um livro muito, assim, para quem estuda hip hop, é uma bíblia, né, praticamente, aí, produzido por ele, editado por ele, pelo professor Alim, da Universidade da Califórnia. Também os livros Struggles for Multilingualism and Linguistic Citizenship, do qual ele é coautor, e também Multilingual Matters. Anteriormente, ele foi também autor de outras obras como Remix, Multilingualism, e coeditor de Never Again, Hip Hop Arts, Activism and Education in Post-Apartheid South Africa, e de Making Sense of People and Place in Linguistic Landscapes. E agora eles têm um projeto muito interessante, eu pude acompanhar nas minhas visitas e nas palestras que o professor Williams já apresentou para a gente, que é um dicionário trilingue de Kaaps, né, então esse dicionário ele é em inglês, Kaaps, né, e outras línguas, né, ele vai explicar certinho, então ele chama Trilingual Dictionary of Kaaps, que é um projeto que ele vem sido feito ao longo dos anos, e se eu não me engano, já foi lançado, aqui está dizendo que vai publicar, mas acredito que foi publicado há umas 2 semanas atrás, se não me engano, depois a gente pergunta para o professor Williams. So, Professor Williams, a huge welcome for you. I would invite you to come and talk to us. It's a pleasure to have you here again in Brazil and to have you here now in the Colóquio of Linguistics Education at UNB. And feel free to take our time and talk to us and enlighten us with your ideas. I think you are on mute, Professor, sorry. No, we can't hear you. Not yet. Maybe because you were, would you like to try to insert your headphones again, maybe? No, not yet. Ok, so o professor Williams vai desconectar de novo o fone dele, vai conectar novamente para a gente conseguir ouvi-lo propriamente, tá bom? Peço só um minutinho. Os problemas técnicos.
I think it
yes, now we can hear you. Yes, here we go.
Yeah,
thank you,
very
Prof.
much. Yeah, it says I'm happy. I'm happy. I think it's because it's connected to my phone as well, and for some reason, let's see, but it should be okay. But I wanted to say thank you very much for that introduction, Camilla. As always, it's always good to hear, myself be introduced in Brazilian Portuguese in such a comprehensive way.
I tried to speak Kaaps. Did you hear,
Yeah.
Professor?
you were almost there. It's Ferdi, yes.
Oh, okay.
yes, almost there. So colleagues, thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak to your group about a language currently in this historical time in South Africa, receiving quite a bit of attention. The prestige or the image of this language that has been rapidly elevated by the speakers and the language makers. Those are the teachers, the politicians, and the academics and activists who are all contributing to enhancing the image and, in the end, also the status of this language. I mean, if I can start sharing my slides, let's see if I can do that. If maybe there we go. Thank you very much, Simone. Yeah, there we go. So I thought about this presentation, and don't worry about the decolonial word being dropped in the sub part of the title. I will still get back to it. But I thought, about presenting this topic to your group because I wanted to sort of inform you about one context, one aspect that should see the transformation of the Kaaps learners. Now, you'll see that there's also the label Afrikaaps, and it's a label that has been, or a glossonym, and the name of a language that has been created in post-apartheid South Africa. In a moment, I will sort of unpack why we have these two labels and are they used interchangeably, and what do they mean. So I'll get into the bit of the history of these labels to get to the challenges that Kaaps learners face in schools, but then also the opportunities that we are creating for the Kaaps learner. The last line that Camilla read of my bio it says that I'm the editor-in-chief of the Trilingual Dictionary of Kaaps. We are going to print that dictionary next month, but then straight after that, we will proceed into developing a grammar guide because what we have heard and learned from Kaaps learners in school is that they would like to know how to write in Kaaps. So the miseducation part in the title speaks to the non-attempts, the disalignment, the inequality that persists or that are reproduced within the education system here in the province that I am located in, the Western Cape in particular, but also beyond. So that's why I thought it would be important to speak to. It also is a play on Lauryn Hill's album, the the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, if you know that album, a very important album. But that album too speaks to challenges and opportunities of the Black child. In this presentation, I hope will resonate with some of the research and the thinking and the challenges you have, you are facing, you have researched, and you want to understand from different contexts how to, sort of adapt or adopt language so that you can also, in a similar way or in a similar fashion, address some of the challenges and opportunities that children of the indigenous and Black Brazilians in particular are facing, especially those who are labeled or deemed to speak Portuguese, for example. Okay, let's clear some of the definition, because I'm sure you've asked yourself, okay, so what is this Kaaps? What is this Afrikaaps? Well, I will use only Afrikaaps in this slide here, but just know that I use it interchangeably. We've come to define it as an African language that has been formed out of a slave lingua franca. When South Africa was colonized first by the Dutch, and we know that the Dutch also had an attempt on the Brazilian side. When we were colonized by the Dutch, the first slaves introduced into the context, they were from Africa, from Angola, they were from Mozambique, they were from Mauritius, but largely they came from Indonesia. So they are the ones that, when they came to the Cape, formed a slave lingua franca that had a mixture of Cape Dutch first. But they also used it not only amongst themselves, but again amongst the indigenous, those who were working, the indigenous who were asked to work with the colonizers, and of course the other types of enslaved populations, prisoners, etc., that was brought by the Dutch. So it's first created or mixed by Cape Dutch, this form of Dutch that emerges at the Cape during the 1600s and the 1700s. So Kaaps's linguistic structure as a slave lingua franca, the sound system, the word formation, the syntactic structure, and the meaning-making characters first formed by this Cape Dutch that is mixed in phonologically, lexically, by variations of Arabic, Low and High Portuguese, that is known as or described by Marius Falkhoff as Malayo-Portuguese, then Bahasa Malay, which is the language of Malay, and then of course by the Khoi and San languages that was used at the Cape at the time. This is the sort of Kukukhuwab, the Ngu, and the Nama languages that was found being used at the Cape. Only later in the 1700s, late 1700s to 1800s, when the English came to colonize properly the Cape and then South Africa, it influenced the speech structure of Kaap speakers. So much so, and you'll see in the later slide, that the free Boers or the free farmers that were part of the Dutch colonizers said that they don't speak this mixed variety that had English in. Anyway, it was later then influenced by English, and then of course standard Afrikaans which gradually marginalized this speech or this language as a result of colonialism and apartheid for hundreds and hundreds of years. I want to go back to just some of the historical bits, because at one point, what was happening at the Cape was surely also happening in northern parts of Brazil because of the slave population. And one can draw that connection quite easily with the slaves who were running away in Bahia, for example, right, at that time. But this is a picture that tells the lie of interaction between the Dutch colonizers on my left-hand side and the indigenous Khoi on my right-hand side. Here, the Dutch, if you can see them offloading trunks of goods, are trading, are going to trade. As you see, there's one Dutch soldier bending down. They are going to trade goods with the indigenous, but they what is quite clear from this picture is that they introduced the first form of technology, that's the gun. Later they would introduce the horse as well to overrun the indigenous Khoi. The indigenous Khoi didn't have guns, they didn't have horses, and what they were speaking were languages without that were dialects, without an army and a navy. The Dutch, on the other hand, of course, had an army and a navy, and so they were the ones who were in power. The Dutch came to settle at the Cape at 1652, but before they did so, they explored the coasts as they were sailing along the coast on the way towards Indonesia. So all the way from, let's say, past Angola, through the Cape Point up to the Indonesia to collect, as we know from history, spices. The first commander here depicted, his name is Jan van Riebeeck. He was the first commander who said that he wanted to come to the Cape to subjugate the local indigenous, to teach them the Dutch language, to teach them the Dutch Christian religion, but also to occupy and basically steal the land from them. For the years that he was at the Cape, he was mostly unsuccessful in persuading the local indigenous to sort of really, work the land, etc., etc. But when he left, he wrote a letter to his successor, Zacharias Wagenaar, in 1662, and said the following: "The slaves here learn nothing but Dutch, and so too the Hottentots, which is the Khoi and San indigenous, so that no other language is spoken here." That's another lie. Of course, there was the Khoranghaï tribes, the indigenous Khoi tribes, who spoke Kukukhowab, who spoke, there were tribes who spoke Ngu, and the slaves, they did not only speak Dutch, but they also spoke a low form of Portuguese, or Malayo-Portuguese. So, when you dig into the archive, when you sort of study Kaaps, and you go into what we typically call the paper archive, not the sort of the verbal archive, you from the 1600s, you discover there is a process of mixture in the emergence of Kaaps as this slave lingua franca first, before it gets heavily mixed in with Malayo, Bahasa Malay, with Malayo-Portuguese, Khoi and San languages, and of course Arabic and later English and this form of standard Afrikaans from the 1800s. But and the reason for this is because there were degrees of contact between the slaves and the Khoi and the Dutch administrators and those traveling through the Cape. The Khoi, for example, Jan van Riebeeck writes, they could communicate. This is Khoi is just a sort of a count noun for the different Khoi tribes to mesh together. Jan van Riebeeck writes that the Khoi were communicating by means of signs, it is hand signs, verbal signs, and many broken Dutch and remarkably English words picked up by accident, he says. And that's because if they pick it up by accident, it's because they were encountering the Dutch administrators and the slaves. Three of the well-known Khoi translators that Jan van Riebeeck used at Samoa, that's how you pronounce it, Duman, and the little girl that he referred to as Ava, but we know her indigenous name is Krotoa, they all knew Dutch to varying degrees. So they all were responsible for contributing to the sort of Khoinization process of what we now understand as early Kaaps. Early in the sense that, historical Kaaps. The little girl Ava, named Krotoa, was the go-between or the translator for Jan van Riebeeck, and he often commented in his diary, or commented on in his diary, that her Dutch was improving, her linguistic repertoire were improving. It was perfect, it's fluent, etc., etc. So this is just a quote from one of his diary entries. So between the 1600s and the 1700s, you have a form of Khoinization process happening in the formation of Kaaps. This is this mixing of these different languages, and then there's a leveling out and simplification and reallocation happening that leads to sort of a creolization endpoint. And the label that is attached to it is Kaaps. But that label, I'll get to it in a moment, is quite interesting because everything that happens to Kaaps predates the invention of Afrikaans. But so over time, and you see this from the 1800s, large-scale linguistic system reorganization takes place, and you can liken it to the entire Kaaps-speaking population, now heavily racialized from the 1800s, being part of a large immersion program where they have to, as per law, learn English and learn Dutch so that they can know it well for literacy purposes or for church literacy purposes. Here, we know that the Krotoa, they knew Portuguese or they knew other languages. Here, Jan van Riebeeck writes about Krotoa complaining to him about Dumont, the other translator, the other Khoi translator. And she says, "Take care, Mynheer van Riebeeck. Dumont is lying and pleading Subat with you, but I'm telling you the truth and overheard Skacher myself." So Subat here, being used by Jan van Riebeeck, it's not a Dutch word, it's not what we call today as an Afrikaans word, but it's a word that was used at that time, still being used in Indonesia, and it refers to jacket. But here, of course, it was taken up in the Dutch language, and was then transformed to mean to plea. So this is a little bit of insight into it. We also know that the other types of slaves that were brought to the Cape, they were relatively free in a different country in Indonesia, in the colony of Batavia. And these are the Mardeke slaves that were brought to the Cape. Van Riebeeck tried very hard to persuade the local indigenous Khoi to toil the land, to help contributing to sort of cultivate the gardens. But he had very little success. He even asked the directors of the Dutch East India Company to send slaves from Angola. They sent a ship from Angola, but on the way the ship sank with all the goods and of course all the slaves. I think totaling about 600 of them. He wrote to the governor of India in 1656 to plead for slaves. And the governor writes back, "Look, I'll send you some industrious Chinese folk or Mardekes to promote your agriculture. But you must know that these Mardekes, they are indolent and lazy by nature." So there was no good view of this group. But these Mardekes, they were referred to as free blacks. Black, not in the sense that we know it today in its heavily racialized nature, but just basically referring to black looking, as you see here's a picture, Indonesians who were free in the sense that they were free before the Dutch came to colonize Batavia. At any rate, these free blacks, for example, and they came at the came to the Cape at the time, and they really sort of introduced into the landscape these various different languages. So when we refer to Indonesian languages, yeah, Sinhalese is also one of those languages. This is an example from our archival research focusing on one of the free black slaves from Colombo, Nicholas Ondaatje, who between the 1728 and 1735, when he lived, wrote 72 letters. He was the son of Juliana Ondaatje, and and he was convicted for minor offenses. If I could just go, yeah, it's not going to go. For minor offenses in Colombo and sent to the Cape as part of his sentence. Many of the letters that he has are written in Sinhalese, but there are 6 letters that reveal sort of lexical form that you can attribute to early forms of Kaaps. He owned slaves like Anthony, for example, but then manumitted them. And here's a picture of his memory book. And in this memory book, he writes down the names of children in the slave lodge that was built at the Cape. Many Afrikaner linguists and Afrikaners liken the names of the kids to the early Kaaps, early Afrikaners, but the names of the kids, they are all slave names because it was the slave lords. But I should also point out that in the slave lords, the slave kids were educated with the children of the Dutch administrators and the free farmers, the Boers, the ancestors of the Afrikaners. And we know this because travelers commented on the language use of the slaves. Here, visiting in 1685, Baron van Reede visits the slave lodge to check on the conditions of not only the slave children, but the white children of the slave masters. And here he notes that, and I'll read first the Dutch and then translate it. Vele kleine kinderen, so wit als zwart, spreken de Neder-Duitse talen zonder enige onderscheid. So a lot of small children, white and black, speaks the Dutch language without any differentiation or distinction. Van Reede, he records this in his diary. He says that the slave children, they speak what is Krom Hollands, which is a sort of a broken form of Dutch. And he points out, he says, a gebroken spraak, a broken speech or language, whereas the white children speaks barmhartig Duits. This is sort of a high, correct form of Dutch. The slave children, he pointed out, should receive instruction in Dutch and be freed after their 25th birthday, adopt the Dutch and language and then the Christian religion. So clearly there was a form of language socialization through the church that for the first 25 years of slave children's lives, they actually learned Dutch. But it's the form of Dutch that is peculiar here, because that form of Dutch, or the Cape Dutch, is very indicative of early Kaaps development. In other words, early Kaaps's colonization process. Van Reede here also writes in his diary, but also expresses concern for the slave children and the fact that they don't speak their own language. Here we get another indication of the data that indeed they were aware of the fact that slave children were speaking other forms of languages, and that they were either bilingual or multilingual. Of course, these two terms weren't, they weren't in writing at the time, right? But here he writes, and I'll speak the Dutch again so that you can hear it, and then I'll translate in a summary form. Het trof mij dat al deze slavenkinderen zonder enige uitzondering Nederduits spraken, terwijl men zou verwacht hebben dat zij, evenals de oudere slaven, als bastard Portugees zouden spreken. So here he says, well, it strikes me when I saw this, that even the slave children, without distinction, Dutch speak. Yes, that's nice, but but I would have expected that even the older slaves, would speak their bastardized or the lower form of Portuguese. And this is all recorded in a book by J.L.M. Franken called Taalhistorische Bijdraes, language, history, historical contributions. It's an Afrikaans, so, and there's no English translation for it. I mean, Van Rieder gives us that insight into the slave lords, but he also allows us to understand what is happening at the Cape at that very early period in terms of the creolization of Cape Dutch into Kaaps. What about the glossonym? What about the name? When does it emerge? Travelers who write from overseas, in the Netherlands, in Europe, they remark about the distinctive names that one can talk about, the forms of Dutch at the Cape. They refer to Hoog-Hollands that comes out of Europe that is used at the Cape. They refer to Laag-Hollands, and that is the one that has been developed at the Cape, but then later was referred to as Afrikaans, the colonial label. And I put blank there. I should have put in Afrikaans. But then they also refer to the Kaaps Hollands, and sorry for the Afrikaans, but so this is the sort of the Cape Dutch that are being heard by those who are trying to imitate people in the Netherlands, who are trying to imitate people speaking Dutch, but they give it that Cape flavor and Cape color. These are very important observations, because what it tells you is that the label Kaaps has a very old age that emerges during the 1700s. By the 1800s, when the English has sort of occupied the Cape, it has colonized it. The Free Dutch um, experience an awakening. They relabel themselves, and they relabel their language as Afrikaans. And but Kaaps Hollands or Kaaps is still being used regularly by journalists and the broader public overseas, still by the 1840s. But the Afrikaner nationalists that had emerged, they didn't like the way this Kaaps Hollands was being used, and they didn't like the fact that they were also told that they speak Kaaps Hollands, because there was too much English in it, and they didn't want to call themselves Kaaps Holland speakers. Rather, they later termed themselves as "We are Afrikaners." In the Het Volksblad, for example, in 1861, you still had publications that were referring to Boere Kaaps, so a version of Kaaps. But then, what full-blown nationalism, and it's these nationalists, these rechte Afrikaners, the brotherhood of real Afrikaners, they pushed forward and says, we do not speak this Kaaps Hollands, this bastardized, low, this afflicted, this dialect, this patois, this jargon, this barbaric, this bastard Hollands, this kitchen language, Kombuis style, and this Hotnot style, this Khoi and San taal. We speak a form of Afrikaans, which is real to us. But even at that time, when they were denouncing it, because they realized and pointed out that this was spoken largely by the children of the slaves, there were still studies that focus on the structure and the grammar of Cape Dutch or Kaaps. And so here are some citations I thought I would put up. Let me go a bit quickly. In the 1800s, the Muslims that were at the Cape, that were brought there from Indonesia, they complained a lot about not having access to sources, and they asked the ambassador to Turkey, because Turkey was responsible in the 1800s for the caliphate the Muslim Caliphate. And they asked for a scholar, an imam, to please come and teach them the right way to interpret the Quran. The ambassador, he wrote to Queen Victoria, to Queen Victoria, Queen Victoria wrote to him, in turn to the Sultan, and then the Sultan sent Abu Bakr Effendi, Amjadi. He was born in Kasnau, located in Zerzur, South Lake of Urmia, which is today northern Iraq. He's a direct descendant of the Holy Prophet Muhammad. But he comes from the Makkan tribe of the Quraysh, from a deer, I think. I get it's hiding there. Highly educated family. I mean, he's a scholar of Islam, and even though his father was killed by the Bedouins and they moved to Turkey, he really excelled by the 1861, where he taught Islamic religion and so forth and so on. So he comes by 1816 or a later period, when we already have this form of emergence of nationalism, Afrikaner nationalism. He comes to the Cape. And I'm going to say something now, which I said before. I wish he had come to the Cape just by 1820s and the 1810s, or even the early 1800s. But okay, I'll explain why I say that. And I'll illustrate why I say that. Here is this Islamic scholar. He's now based in Turkey. He receives a lot of attention by the Sultan. He's just a friend of the Sultan. And the Sultan, and through decree, sends him to the Cape. When he comes to the Cape via Sardinia, France, and England, gets on a boat and he comes to the Cape. What he discovers at the Cape was, besides what is happening at the slave lords, and slavery has now been on its way out, he understands that the Muslims at the Cape did not receive proper instruction. At the time, you could only print books in Roman script, not in Arabic script, but you could do so in Turkey. So he set himself the task to learn, one, Cape Dutch, and then two, to write a textbook on instructions on Islamic rituals. This is his Bayn al-Din. The Bayn al-Din is a very long text because it has the Meresud ud-Din, but this is the contents, and it basically gives a lot of instruction on what to do in terms of Bayn al-Din and the Meresud ad-Din when you are a Muslim. This book that he had written had three introductions: one in Turkish, one in Arabic, and one in Cape Dutch. The Turkish introduction was for the Sultan, his friend, sent to the Sultan. The Arabic was ironically not for the Muslims at the Cape, but for the Muslims in Mozambique and in Mauritius. And then the Cape Dutch introduction, which researchers today indicate as Arabic Afrikaans, actually was for the Cape Muslims. But here, when you look at this, what is termed the Arabic Afrikaans introduction, a lot of the words being used are actually Kaaps words. Here, for example, so I don't have a summary, but I'm pointing to these words: levendig, missie, veral, place, gegief, and so forth and so on. These are all early Kaaps words being used. But as I said before, at the time, one would forgive the interpretation, because by 1861 there has been a proper immersion program that the children of the slaves have been put into in sort of continuously learning standard Afrikaans while they spoke their Cape Dutch, their Kaaps, Hollands in the everyday life. So you get sort of a sense of that in books like Straatpraatjes, and then Straatpraatjes was published in 1909, from 1909 to 1922. And by 1940, writers like Sidney Verdon Peterson here would also capture the lived experiences of Kaaps speakers in a novel. And in journal articles like The Weekend, Dinavik. But we know, if you know anything about South Africa, apartheid has suppressed a lot of the creativity and the use of languages, amongst other things. So Kaaps becomes this resistance forms of language. And here, folks like Patrick Peterson, here he is. There's that's Leonard Koza, Adam Small, Peter Snyders. The poetry that they produces is a form of resistance or protest poetry or protest creative work against the apartheid government from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It is in the 1980s, the most violent period, where you still have Kaaps being used to resist the sort of the apartheid government. Here, an untitled poem by a very young Samale Francis still demonstrates the lexical phonological constructions, lexical items, and sort of agglutinated forms and the use of English that is characteristic of how it was used back in the 1700s, in the 1800s. And the reason for that, of course, is that Kaaps has never been codified into a dictionary, codified or developed, or its orthography developed into a grammar until today, until this present moment. So, this is a picture of the beautiful Kaaps dictionary cover. And I'm sorry, I can't go to some of the, because now all the pictures on top of the image, the words. But this is a picture, just to say, of the Kaaps dictionary that will be published next month. It will be a first the edition, and we hope that the education department takes it up. This is also the grammar guide is being developed by the Society for the Advancement of Kaaps, or Society for the Advancement of Kaaps. We've dropped a Y here on top and put an IE. But anyway, the text behind here basically indicates that there has been significant advances in the development of Kaaps in post-apartheid South Africa today. We not only in its image, but also in its corpus, because it's part of a large intellectualization project. In other words, transforming Kaaps for the education system so that it can be used for abstract and decontextualized forms of knowledge, such as mathematics, science, and so forth and so on. But on top of that, the Bible is being translated fully into Kaaps. We have established our own academic journal, and there are many advances. So significant is the fact that we have designed materials for the schools, but I'll get to that in a moment. Okay, a lot of the Kaaps learners today, when they are born, for the first 6 years, they speak Kaaps, they learn Kaaps. When you go to school, or you go, you come out of the hospital, there are texts available, books available for babies to read, to hear the mothers read Kaaps. Here's a book called Listen to Mummy, Word for Mummy. But there are also authors who write children books in Kaaps. So the children is supposed to encounter Kaaps in the school. But most of these texts are not assigned on the curriculum, on the school curriculum. The one here, Keegan's and Samir, might be in the early part, but as a matter of importance and as a matter of decolonizing the school curriculum, they should be assigned to the school. Because after the first 6 years, the Kaaps learner goes to the school and only learn standard Afrikaans, so that immersion program still continues, and English, of course. So Kaaps. So what happens is that they learn in translation via Kaaps into those what some authors have called speakers say foreign-sounding languages. Now, many studies on Kaaps in the education context have been implemented and done, from early childhood development or ECD centers to primary school, and then of course university. The study by Sharon Daniels, for example, looks at how children in ECD centers or early childhood centers, creches, actually use Kaaps in such a way that it advances or helps or manages play. Andre DeRose or Trevor DeRose, for example, shows that in primary schools there are many factors contributing to the literacy proficiency of grade 7 learners, and importantly, of course, Kaaps features here quite strongly. Cooper study on literacy as well in 2018 shows how language ideologies factor importantly in how schools not only operate, but how they see and view and include Kaaps in the schools. So in the conclusion of his study, and I put the reference here, but he basically, we can summarize it as follows: that Kaaps is not meeting the standard for use. So in other words, there's not a standardized dictionary or grammar guide that can be used in the school. Okay, Kaaps is illegitimate for school assessment tasks. Students can't write. Students can write in question papers because the terms must be right. It should say can't write. Then also, Kaaps learners are penalized in assessments, in examinations when writing in Kaaps, and that's true. Very briefly, I was speaking to a group of youth a couple of months ago, and without me asking, many of them said, "Look, why are we being penalized, brought down when we write in Kaaps?" Because for them, it's the most natural thing to do when they write "furry," which should be "furdi" or "for the." Let me go quickly through the other slides, and then I come to what I want to come to. So, yeah, other studies point out that it still remains a language that is academically unacknowledged now for centuries. It's to a large extent ignored, and when we think about it in terms of or alongside race, it is extremely stigmatized. Apologies. Because it may have extensive networks in emerging prominence in popular culture, etc. But there's always subjective factors that it's still referred to as a slang, not appropriate for the economy and education. In a beautiful study by Aziza January, who says she's almost proud, reflections on her language biography, we see the importance of the linguistic repertoire. Here you see her reflect, on her journey and re-encounters what Kaaps as part of her linguistic repertoire. And it's very good to quote. And then what I want to plead with myself to risk using Kaaps more. I use it with my colleagues at school. Why not extend this to my white Afrikaans colleagues at I think it's the management of the education sectors. I forget what the acronym is, where I do not have to prove amongst myself. She goes on to say, amongst other things, I came to realize that my feelings and attitudes were not unique, that other Kaaps speaking people have the same feelings of inferiority. When you speak to Kaaps speakers and you ask them, how does it feel to speak Kaaps? Do you feel erased, not listened to, not heard? The answer that you get often, all the time. That's how they feel, all the time. Peter Pluderman, a colleague of mine at UWC, wrote a brilliant study on language policy. And here he says the important takeaway from his book is that ensuring mother tongue-based bilingual education for Kaaps learners is important for Kaaps into school, for Kaaps speakers for learning in school. A lot of study authors write about the importance of including Kaaps, that it should be a medium of instruction. This is what from Michael Lecordier. You can learn it lexically, but then he asks which words will be used as a standard. So again, the idea of a standard emerges. And I'm going to come back to it in the conclusion and maybe in the Q&A as well. But here he also points out assessment and training are important for the teachers. Okay, so we understand it quite clearly, and we know the studies. But in the Center for Multilingualism and Diversities Research, we want to sort of center the Kaaps linguistic repertoire of the learners in the classroom. So my colleague Robin Tyler has been implementing this big bilingual learning materials project, and this project is being run in many sort of primary schools. It focuses on isiXhosa, which is one of the Nguni languages, and then of course um, on Kaaps as well. It tries to capture the translanguaging that is happening in the classroom, and I'll give an example very shortly. This is a team. On top, you have the isiXhosa team. Some of the Kaaps people here. This is Robin here. Yes, she is again. Some of you might know her, who have visited the center. The first materials, bilingual materials, that is constructed in a translanguaging way. In other words, it's capturing the translanguaging of the learners in the classroom, is the iscientia, meaning our science. And this was for grade 4 natural science and technology. So it's a textbook that was used in the classroom. And in the classroom, the assessment pointed to learners, where learners previously had a 30% pass rate, the pass rate went up by 80%, which is remarkable. The Western Cape Education Department in our province selected the center, the CMDR, and this material to be used in over 176 schools. And Professor Kleber, our colleague, Professor Lakite Makalela, he's part of this team, even though he's based in Johannesburg at Wits University. Okay, we said if that was the remarkable result for isiXhosa, what about Kaaps? We first had to sort of understand, where teachers are with this. Is it possible to create these materials? What will be the feedback? So we had a workshop, and at the workshop we had teachers, senior subject advisors, and academics, and they all gave feedback on the current curriculum materials being used, for example, in grade 6 natural science and technology. We looked at the handbook, for example, and the teacher says that the learners find this boring. They can't relate to this. These are the Kaaps learners. They can't relate to these handbooks. It doesn't reflect the lived and cultural experiences of the learners. The annual teaching plan is a guide, and so this guide doesn't really help you in how you should sort of construct materials. One of the grade 6 teachers says, who teaches natural science technology, that majority of my work does not come from the textbook. So teachers here reconstruct materials to suit or to relate to the lived experiences of the learners. Because lots of them, for example, the multimodal materials are of white pictures, white characters, not black or indigenous characters. The maths teachers, for example, points out the limitation of the handbook being used in grade 6. He says that there are vocabulary, word problems, language barriers that prevent Kaaps learners from learning, for example, adding and subtraction. And here he makes an example. When I teach my maths, then I sometimes use, especially with the angles and stuff, acute angle. He uses the word acute angle. And now I'm going to go into the Afrikaans class, because remember, Afrikaans is being taught is the language of instruction, not Kaaps. So that's why he's referring to Afrikaans. So I go into the Afrikaans class, and I'm translating it for you. Then I have to say, okay, the sharp corner, but they don't get it. So they don't know what a sharp corner is. But then I say an acute corner, and the immediate moment, So and then I say, when you refer to a small child, he's cute. You don't say to an adult that you're sexy or cute, right? Then they only get it. The other part is also about writing in Kaaps. One of the grade 6 teachers says, okay, we're already teaching in Kaaps as well, but actually putting it on paper, remember, how do we spell the words? How will we spell it differently? Because there are different ways of spelling words in Kaaps. We see that this is how you write in Afrikaans, this is how you write essays in Afrikaans, but the learners, they write gibberish. In other words, they mix it all together, English, Kaaps, etc., right? But if you're a Kaaps speaker, and then one of the curriculum material translators chimes in, you will be able to read it. And that's true. If you're a Kaaps speaker, you are able to read Kaaps. But writing Kaaps is a different story. And to come back to my point, remember, part of the dictionary is that we are also developing a grammar guide. Okay, then the theme comes up, what about assessment? Okay, teachers are saying, translate the assessments also into Kaaps. And make a distinction between formal and informal assessments. Connect to the subject advisors and the department, the Western Education Department. And grading, right? That should also be part of it, right? Okay, let me just I'll skip this slide just for interest of time. Here is part of the translanguaging example. So let me go through. So here they are talking about, if I can get it, they are talking about electricity and coming through. So he says, okay. The teacher says, okay, she's got it. He says something very true. He said, you are going to get shocked if the electricity is on. And then one of the learners says, yes, ma'am. And then she switches to Kaaps. So I said, so let me switch to Kaaps. I'll say it. I'll read it. So as die draad los is en die krag is af, dan wat van die draad? What happens to the draad? Can you shock? And then the learner says, no. And the teacher says, no. Hoekom nie? And then there's chatter. And then one learner says, because that's in life, because there's no life. And there's no power. And then the teacher says also, because there's no life. Okay, this allowed us to produce this. This material is currently being tested out in a school and was collaboratively developed with the society. So we hope by next year we would have data to show that this type of material has a form of impact on the improvement of the learners. And the materials are like the science here too. It's bilingual, it alternates. There are bilingual glossaries, instructions. There's fluid translanguaging in the text, and Kaaps is placed in the initial position ahead of English. So let me just conclude. Okay, so we have Kaaps being developed. We define it as a language, an African language that was first a slave lingua franca. It has a rich history. It comes before Afrikaans, even before the introduction of English into the landscape. And what we've learned from the workshop with the teachers is that, if we develop Kaaps within the classroom, and we investigate the translanguage strategies, which is currently happening, we will learn more about Kaaps. The parents are the important stakeholders here. So we are at the moment trying to argue that Kaaps should be added to the curriculum as a second additional language subject. Why? And there's a question mark next to it. It is not an official language, and that's why I have this last line here. And so it can't be used as a language of instruction, whether it's a first language subject or second language subject, but it can be added to the curriculum as a second additional language. So we hope all the efforts that we are implementing now, by next year, we will see some important changes being affected for Kaaps. We are already seeing this at university level. Kaaps is being included in language policies. It should be included in the basic education system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's always a pleasure to hear you. And before we go to the Q&A session, would you mind if I say a few words in Portuguese, Prof, since we are translanguaging?
Absolutely, go for it.
Só para esclarecer, pessoal que está assistindo, assim, eu acho que deu para captar as ideias principais antes da gente ir para sessões de perguntas e respostas. Inclusive, eu ia pedir para quem tiver pergunta já ir colocando no chat, que a gente vai traduzindo aqui para o professor Williams. Uma coisa muito interessante, que é importante esclarecer aqui, a diferença entre o Afrikaans, que é o Afrikaner, que é a língua oficial falada pelos holandeses, e o Afrikaaps, ou Kaaps, que é essa língua que o professor está falando, em vias de ser oficializada, e que ela é marginalizada, e essa questão a questão muito racial, né, imbricada com a língua, né? Então tem toda essa questão interseccional de língua e raça numa sociedade muito estratificada pós-apartheid, né? Que é a sociedade sul-africana, assim como a nossa é, né? E a gente sabe, o professor citou as questões do português, as línguas indígenas faladas no Brasil, e esse trabalho lindo que eles estão fazendo de fazer um dicionário trilingüe, que é justamente um dicionário inglês, Afrikaner, que é essa língua que é dos holandeses. Então, o Afrikaner era uma língua muito ligada aos brancos, né, na África do Sul. Então, tem o Afrikaaps, que é o Kaaps, que é essa língua mais dos colored, né, que seriam esse nome, né, criado também pelo bem colonial, né, assim como nós temos pretos e pardos, lá tem esse in the middle, aí que são os coloreds, né, que aí não é só pretos e brancos, mas também tem muitas, são os miscigenados, né, da sociedade sul-africana. E é importante a gente pensar essas relações, e aí já estou dando ideias para vocês perguntarem, essas relações de língua e raça, né, numa sociedade como a África do Sul, essas relações de multilinguismo, né, que num país onde tem as 12 línguas oficiais no momento, o Kaaps não é uma delas ainda, então é uma luta ainda que o professor aí engaja, né, dos falantes de Kaaps, né, que é parecido com o Afrikaaps, mas não é o Afrikaaps, não é o Afrikaner, que é essa língua dos holandeses, e, portanto, a importância que teve até na sociedade pré-apartheid, né, e até o apartheid, que foi apenas as línguas dos colonizadores serem reconhecidas, que no caso era o inglês, né, a língua dos ingleses, e a língua dos holandeses, que era o Afrikaner, né? Então, para a gente poder conseguir visualizar, para a gente que está num contexto diferente, todo esse contexto que o professor falou. E aí agora eu abro para perguntas. So, Prof, there are some questions here.
Yes.
There's actually a comment from Professor Paula Kobuchi saying that she loved the child's book. It's quite beautiful. Even the covers, they are really beautiful. And there also a question from Professor Kleber when he asked, Professor Quentin Williams, I really enjoyed your conference. How many people speak Afrikaans in South Africa? I think here it's Afrikaaps, Professor Quentin.
I think so, yeah.
In other African countries, based on your research, and what parameters could we have to develop a policy for promoting and valuing minority languages?
Yeah, I think the thing that I've asked for a survey that actually is appropriate for doing so, because the national survey only covers official languages, not historically marginalized languages like Kaaps. So the challenge that we have is that we need to test. We can replicate a survey to do so, but most linguists, when they get statistics back from government, they say, even though you say that there are 72% people speaking Afrikaans, for example, of those 72%, 3%, let's say 65% of them are Afrikaaps speakers, are black speakers. They are the majority of the speakers. But because on the official census, you don't have it indicated. And it's the same for when you apply for entry into university. It's not an option to tick. So there's no good data to collect. But if you have any suggestions of surveys that could be used, that would be very, very good for us. To help us, Professor Kleber. Even if it's a social-linguistic type of survey or a survey used by the Brazilian government to collect that particular data, especially ones that are targeted for the indigenous population, because we share a lot in terms of that community historically. Because you don't have a survey, for example, that captures Portuguese, do you? There's no survey that says, okay, now indicate Portuguese. So the second question also is one of a hot debate at the moment. What parameters do we use to develop a policy for promoting, valuing, and valuing minority languages. First of all, is the notion of standardizing languages or standard languages appropriate for minority languages? Shouldn't we talk about or develop a formalization framework that goes beyond what Einar Haugen has given us in terms of standard language model, right? So selecting codification of the language into a dictionary or grammar and its elaboration. Our national body, PANSALB, the Pan South African Language Board, does the policy that it has does not make or cannot make room for languages like Kaaps, because the policy does not promote and value minority languages. So at the moment, there's no framework suitable or relevant enough for us to revise that policy, or at least not one is being pursued. So if we are going to develop and pursue a policy for promoting and valuing minority languages, we start with, okay, here is a framework, a formalization framework that is inclusive enough, that helps us to value the linguistic repertoires, the agency and voice, that is the linguistic citizenship of minority language speakers, but then also the way that they, or understandings of how they interpret languages. That should all factor into a formalization framework, and it shouldn't just be corpus based, because then you have the quantitative model still superseding a qualitative model where that deems to value and promote a policy for minority languages. If that makes any sense, from my side, it's something that I'm thinking with, and it's something that I've had conversations with UNESCO, especially the UNESCO chair in multilingualism and language policy based in Brazil, Professor, I forget his name now, Gilvan, I forget the Morero, I think. I don't know. I forget the surname, right? But I think you know who I'm talking about. So I have not found, to be honest with you, Professor Silva, and if somebody can send anything to me, I have not found a policy suitable enough for promoting and valuing Kaaps in South Africa. We have to develop it.
Yes, thank you, Prof. I think you are talking about Professor Gilvan. I think
Yes.
he's from Santa Catarina.
Yes, Santa Catarina.
Yeah,
Yes.
he's from Santa Catarina. Yeah,
yes.
They have a huge group on multilingualism and
yes. Yeah, he has your surname, De Oliveira.
Yeah.
I don't know, are you family?
Sure. It's a famous name.
Yeah. it's very general. Yes.
So, Prof, I also have a question,
Yes.
because when I was there in Cape Town, I realized that most of people who I was talking about Kaaps, most of them who speak Kaaps, they didn't recognize Kaaps as a language, but as a variety. So how is going to be this process of officialize a language? And I know this trilingual dictionary is part of that, and it's amazing how you guys are putting the how can I say, the language from the orality to the written language, and
Yes.
because there's this huge influence from Afrikaans, but it's not the same, and it's not the same language. But most of them, I think, sometimes they realize, they recognize the language like we study Portuguese here, because Portuguese for us is not a language; it's a variety, like Black English, but Kaaps, it is a language. So how is it going to be this process to the population to understand, I actually speaking a different language? How is it going?
We have to, it's a very important point that you're raising, Camilla, because we have to understand that where this idea comes from, Kaaps as a language variety. It comes from the Afrikaner nationalists who first developed their language into a standard language, and then said, no, we speak a language, but those slaves, they speak a variety of our language. And how do you solidify that permanently in the not only the social psyche of the community at large, but also in the institutions? While you first codify that language and you elaborate it, of course, standardize it, but then you use your academy, then you use your scholarship, your science to advance it so that it can be, so that the knowledge that you are developing then becomes the not only the myths, not only create myths, but it becomes the wisdom. So for the wisdom that is out there, permanently out there, that covers a variety of the language, is because of the knowledge being developed by that has been developed by Afrikaans linguists, and that feeds into language policy. We are trying to work very hard to overturn that, to undo that, so that people can unlearn this wisdom that Kaaps is a language variety, that in fact it is a language, it is, you live through this. And unfortunately, we are fighting a fight, we are being fought back on, and but that's every day. So we have to do what we are trying to do, and it's not just us, a lot of people are doing it, is to raise the critical language awareness, that Kaaps is a language. So now, if a dictionary appears and then the grammar guide appears, there is, it will add to this movement. It has truly become a movement. It needs to now also then be used in what we call controlling contexts, controlling domains that reproduce what Kaaps is in those contexts for empowerment. UCT, University of Cape Town, has passed a revised language policy and has included Kaaps. UWC, we hope will do the same soon, because it would be a travesty if they don't, because I work there. But more importantly, it's being used in Parliament. So politicians are using it as well. And so all the official records are, so those are just a couple of examples. So we still have a way to go. So its recognition might not happen in my lifetime. It might go beyond me, but what we put in place today through the society, through the universities and through schools will lead to that fact. I'm pretty sure of it. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. That's when I see you talking, it reminds me the Nhengatu, which was a language that we had in colonial Brazil, but the Portuguese colonial empire was so good in erasing languages and cultures that they forbidden the speakers to speak Nhengatu, which was a lingua franca as well, spoken between the new Portuguese Brazilian people and the indigenous people. It was a strong lingua franca, and I can imagine that maybe if that wasn't forbidden, maybe would be our Kaaps,
Yes, absolutely.
So that's important. That's why your struggle to the Kaaps of socialization, it sounds so beautiful to me, and I think to Professor Kleber as well, because we didn't have this opportunity to make our language that was now erased and forgotten language now.
Absolutely, and for hundreds of years, it's not been codified. So we were writing down the word for lemon, for example, and we were spelling it the way that we spell it. So we say lemon, L-I-M-O-E-N, or lamoon, L-A-M-O-E-N, which is lemon, or orange. Sorry, not lemon, orange. And we discovered that was spelled exactly the same in a Kaaps dictionary in 1844. So, yeah, you make up your mind about how rich this language is.
Yeah, that's amazing. We have another question here from Professor Kleber. He's asking, what is your philosophical position on multilingualism and linguistic citizenship in Africa and Brazil? And how can we promote active citizenship in our schools that values different linguistic repertoires of different languages, especially minority languages?
Yeah, any framework, any philosophical framework that has as its endpoint equality and emancipation and restoration is important to understanding how we should approach the study of multilingualism, and then by extension linguistic citizenship in Africa and Brazil. I mean, the point of departure should be the speaker and what the speaker does with that language and how they use their linguistic repertoires as historically marginalized or historically minority speakers, whether it's in Angola, whether it's in Mozambique, and whether it's in Brazil, in any part of Brazil. Those aspects are extremely important that you as linguists need to take seriously. Now I know, and we've spoken about this. You are set in the Bactinian tradition, and there is some limitation to that, because if you only want to sort of focus on the sounds of the speakers because you wanted to describe the the grammar of the speakers, you might miss the quality and of the agency and voice of the speakers. That does not necessarily focus on grammar or phonology and phonetics or the sounds of the languages that they speak, but on the agency, that is their ability to bring about change and their voices. So I think if you are going to promote active citizenship in your schools that value different linguistic repertoires of different languages, especially the minority, they need to be seen, but they need to be active contributors to how they are seen in the schools. So use the indigenous minority languages, transform the linguistic landscapes, include it in the language policies, revise the language policies, validate their identities and their languages in the classroom. Obviously there are teachers who come from, for example, from the areas. There are teachers today, young teachers who are Portuguese speakers, who you train, and then you, through your discipline, your of instruction in Portuguese, train out the sort of the agency and the voice that is Portuguese. Help the teachers to bring it back, so it also validates their identity. Because I think teachers, when they are Portuguese speakers, and I'm sure they are of a generation that are now being trained to be teachers, but to instruct in Portuguese. When they come into the training session, they want to be validated too. But the learners too must also feel validated and affirmed. But key to both of them is also the voice of the parents to contribute to that inclusion, to contribute to that active citizenship. That goes beyond just mere critical language awareness, because critical language awareness can become lip service to, let's say, Portuguese, can become lip service to the linguistic repertoires of the learners and the teachers. We don't want that to happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. I would like to call back Professor Kleber. We are close to ends, and thank you very much, Professor, again. Let me see if there's another question, but I don't think so. But also, thank you, Professor. It's always a pleasure to hear you. Yes. And I have so many questions on my mind right now, you know. But we'll have in November.
Yes. Then you will have a lot of coffee discussions over that.
Yes, thank you, Prof.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Professor Kent Williams, for your great presentation. I really appreciate it. Our group really appreciate it. Well, thank you, Camila, to establish some collaboration with Professor Kent Williams and teams in South Africa. I'm so happy. I'm so motivated to work with you, Quentin, because your conception about the word is pretty much the same of my conception about the word, because it's so common in our society to to think or to establish some, or to do some effort to establish some language policies to promote some language, but not minority language. In my point of view, that you discussed with us, Afrikaans is so important in our country. Yeah, like in Brazil, Quilombos is so important in our country. Indigenous is so important in our country. Deaf person is so important in our country. And my point of view, it's necessary, Camila, to rethink some methodological, epistemological, ontological perspective to implement a kind of language policy to respect another minority, like in Brazil, that you have in Brazil. And I'm so happy with your consideration, your conference, because some idea that you have in the African continent, in Africa, South Africa in this case, you can apply, or Camila, to rethink some praxeology in our class, in our society, to implement the language policies in Brazil. It's so interesting, and I'm so happy too because we celebrate the project that you approved in the FAPES final, and this collaboration between University of São Paulo, University of Brasilia, and Cape Town University, it be great because you have the possibility to have some meetings, to write some books, to organize some special issues, to work together. I'm sure that this project, Camila, will represent, for me, it is a kind of mirror because represent African culture. Because in African culture, it's so important to work together, to create a kind of quilombo with Brazilian researchers and African researchers. And of course, that can do it as your trajectory in linguistics not African, but in the world inspired us. Because when I was like a visit scholar at a Penn State and CUNY in New York and Stanford University, many researchers in this university talk about Quentin Williams. So, Kleber, you need to talk to Quentin Williams. Quentin Williams is a great person to interact. Oh, so now I'm so happy because Quentin is my friend now. And we create some strategies together. And thank you for your wonderful presentation. I really, really appreciate it. And Camila, well, you're wonderful. When I listen to you, I learn a lot. In the name of our group in Brazil, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to learn with you, Quentin Williams and Camila.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Vou aproveitar o momento rapidamente agora, agradecer novamente Quentin Williams e Camila pelo ótimo colóquio que nos conduziu. E o mês que vem nós vamos ter a oportunidade singular de receber o meu querido colega Daniel Silva, da Federal de Santa Catarina, que escreveu um livro belíssimo sobre esperança, né? Como ver o ensino como esperança, baseado totalmente na teorização de Paulo Freire. Então, você que está nos acompanhando agora no YouTube, seja ao vivo ou seja no nosso canal, conecte no próximo mês e assista o 37º Colóquio de Educação Internacional, onde a gente vai receber o professor Daniel Silva e o professor Lee, também, que acho que está na Inglaterra, que vai estar com a gente então, tá bom? Então, agradeço muito e siga-nos nas redes sociais. E agradeço a Simone por todo o apoio, tanto Simone quanto Tamara aqui no Backstage. E é sempre um prazer estar com vocês às sextas-feiras, pensando e repensando políticas para o Sul Global. Em nome da professora Paula Cobussi, que é a coordenadora do GECAL juntamente comigo, eu queria saudar mais uma vez o professor Quentin Williams e a professora Camila pelo brilhante colóquio que nos promoveu nessa tarde. Muito obrigado e ótima tarde para todos vocês.